Welcome back into the Lions247 Podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. This is episode number 3 of game week number 3 here in Penn State's 2025 schedule. Villanova makes the trip from Philadelphia on Saturday as a 48-point underdog against Penn State. We learned a lot more about the Wildcats, what they're bringing to Beaver Stadium on our last episode. We had a Villanova reporter on, Dylan Johnson. If you missed that one, it went live on Wednesday. I encourage you to check that out. We also had a good recruiting conversation with Tyler Calvaruso about Penn State's latest 2026 class pickup and what could come next for that class as time starts to get a little crunch in putting that 2026 group together. Here, we're going to put focus on Penn State's final preparations. We got to go to the practice field on Wednesday afternoon into the evening. We heard from James Franklin. We caught up with a few veteran players on the practice field afterward. A ton of coverage over at Lions247.com. As always, offensive notebook, defensive notebook, photo gallery, video highlights, and a lot more, including commentary from those players and James Franklin. We're going to get into some of that right now, eventually get to our predictions and players to watch for Game 3 between Penn State and Villanova. Let me bring in my colleagues Daniel Gowan and Mark Brennan as we get you set for kickoff. 3:30 on Saturday, and third consecutive game in which Penn State's considered a 40-plus point favorite. They failed to cover the betting spread the last couple of weeks, did get to 2-0, and this is the non-conference finale, the final tune-up before a bye week, followed by a trip back to Beaver Stadium for the whiteout against Oregon. Mark, let's begin with you. This is through 120 minutes of football, maybe some things left to be desired in different areas of the field. And we know there are some things that they want to get ironed out here, some wrinkles before they have to take on currently the number 4 team in the country in the Oregon Ducks on September 27th. So how important is this matchup in the grand scheme of things for a team that wants to get to a national championship game?
Yeah, I think it's important for some individual players. I mean, I think Drew Aller and Nick Singleton have both earned the benefit of the doubt. But having said that, you would like to see both of them be more consistent heading into that bye week before, facing what's going to be the number 4 team in the country, if not even higher. So, Drew Aller looked fine in game 1, but kind of was not his typical self in game 2. And, James Franklin admitted it that, Nick Singleton just has to kind of cut it loose and stop thinking so much. And again, these guys have both done it. And we talked earlier in the week, how much of this can you chalk up to them not playing as much as maybe they would have in earlier camps, not doing as much in the spring, erring on the side of caution, which you absolutely, I would rather see them do that. But I think for those two players, it's important that we see them be who they usually are. And overall, team-wise, I think defensively they've been fine. Offensively, to me, explosive plays, you really need to see more of them early and often in this game. And then third down conversions. These are things that they should be able to do kind of against this level of team, especially with the offensive line and the weapons they have.
We got some offensive focus coming your way. We're going to get into some young players to watch as well, as this may be that final audition type opportunity for some of the younger backup pieces trying to stake claim to consistent roles come Big Ten action. But Daniel, I want to get over to defense with you because James Franklin was pretty open after practice on Wednesday and that they have dealt with some issues for defensive communication. I think several of us in the press box last Saturday could pick up on some of the body language, some of the confusion perhaps pre-snap and in between some of the plays. Obviously, at the end of the day, the Nittany Lions came away with a shutout win. They've given up 1 touchdown through 2 matchups, and that was with 25 seconds left and a lot of third stringers on the field against Nevada. But James Franklin wants this thing buttoned up before the Ducks come to town. I'm sure it's major frustration for them to have to go through this multiple years where early September is kind of marred by some communication issues. What did you learn from what James Franklin told us, and what will you be looking at come game day?
Well, based on what James Franklin said Wednesday night after practice, this is a very different issue than there was last year that necessitated Dan Connor having to step in and relay the play call from Tom Allen to Connor to Kobe King. The feedback from Franklin and then from Dan Connor on a Zoom earlier Thursday is that it's basically just the crowd noise right now. That is a big, impediment towards some of that communication. I mean, we saw it. Like Amari Campbell's got both hands over his ears. He already has the foam in there over the ear hole, like Drew Aller has, and he's bending down. The players are surrounding him. So it was pretty obvious from the press box that, something was going on. Like you said, it didn't seem to necessarily affect anything on the field. But when you talk about Oregon coming to town, I mean, a Nevada crowd, an FIU crowd, you had more than 100,000 people in there, but an Oregon crowd, it's going to be, X% louder than it was these past 2 weeks. There's going to be more people, and you're going to be going against an Oregon team that, if you're not lined up and you're not in the right spot, like, they're going to make you pay. They have the talent to do it. And that's also a team that I really feel like is coached to have that killer instinct to make things like that happen. So we'll see. I mean, I talked to Amari Campbell after the season opener, and I didn't necessarily directly ask him, like, is everything okay? I was more, how is the communication going? And he gave positive feedback. All the players have been generally positive about it. Like, it feels like the play call is getting in. They feel like they know what they're supposed to do out there, and they're theoretically in the right spots. But it is this little subplot coming out of a shutout, and I think also something that is really visible. I mean, there's sometimes these things that, like, we don't really see them, but we hear them. But you see Amari Campbell with his hands over his ears. You see Denai Dennis-Sutton staring at the sideline, gesturing. You see them running Denai Dennis-Sutton onto the field later in the play clock and pulling someone off. Like, there's some moving pieces here, and I think Saturday you'd really like to see that buttoned up.
Yeah, and there's two stark differences from where they were coming out of game 2 last year. If people recall, it was kind of a what's going on here moment in the first half. Bowling Green scored 3 touchdowns in the first half against them, something like that, maybe 17 points, whatever it was. But second half, they were buttoned up. And what we heard then was communication issues, but it was really tethered to Tom Allen's raspy voice that we had trouble hearing sometimes, staying a few yards from him. And so you had Dan Connor getting the call from Tom Allen, and then Dan Connor giving the call to Kobe King. I did follow up with James on Wednesday just to make sure, hey, is Jim Knowles holding up his end of the bargain here? He says, yeah, it's nothing related to that. It's other stuff. And so, like you said, crowd noise. And they're going to be a lot louder later this month when they begin Big Ten play.
That should have been the last question of the press conference.
Mark, when we get over to the offensive side of the ball, I think we're all still really curious what's happening at running back beyond Nick Singleton and Katron Allen. Maybe we thought by now, certainly against FIU, we thought there'd be more opportunities for other running backs to get involved. They didn't use a third running back at all. And, Nick Singleton scored a touchdown run late in the fourth quarter of that victory over FIU. So game flow didn't work out the way it would have been nice for some of those younger players to get their looks. Cam Wallace flashed a bit game 1. Corey Smith less so with some work in game 1. And we've yet to see Quentin Martin involved. Those were the 3 running backs with what we call the varsity group on the practice field on Wednesday, along with Nick Singleton and Katron Allen. And all 3 of them were wearing scout team jerseys. So hard to figure out who has the edge there. Based on game looks, I'd have to go with Cam Wallace. He was also the guy who was RB3 going into last season before his injury. But Mark, considering what we think this game could be, again, what we think it could be, we thought last week would be one way and it wasn't. But this, to me, seems like a very important storyline in this matchup is, can somebody separate themselves, make the case to RB3? Because I don't think Stan Drayton and this coaching staff want to be fiddling with who they're getting involved in Oregon in crunch time.
Yeah, I think getting Quinn Martin involved is really important. I mean, we had a chance to see the other 2 kids, and both of them did well in limited action against Nevada. Maybe not quite limited, but Quinn Martin, again, erring on the side of caution with him as he was banged up and easing him back. But now I don't think you want his first game action to be Oregon. So if he's ready to go, the thing about Quinn is that I think he can do some things that complement Nick Singleton and Katron Allen. We've heard that he's more of a pass receiving threat than maybe the other 2 guys are at this point of his career. So, I think it's important for him to get an opportunity and get out there. And I wonder, as we watch this game, guys, if he is out there, does that mean he's number 3? Or does that mean, okay, they got to look at the other 2 guys in games. Now they need to get a look at him before Big Ten play starts. So my eyes, this isn't my player to watch, but kind of a sub-player to watch will be Quentin Martin, because we haven't seen him yet this season. And I think he does bring a unique skill set that could be complementary to both of those guys, that you could actually see him if in passing situations down the line do some things out there on the field if somebody needs a rest or somebody gets banged up or whatever.
And Quentin Martin's a guy that we've been told much of the offseason and through preseason camp was going to be kind of a key piece on special teams. And that hasn't been the case quite yet. And James Franklin, I kind of followed up on Quentin Martin with him yesterday after practice. And I asked about his availability. And I think he did a pretty good job of clarifying that he was unavailable in game one, but he was available in game two. He was listed as questionable before game one. So let's see if he gets a crack on the field. A guy that came to campus as a top 24/7 prospect. But as we said, Cam Wallace and Corey Smith, both there. They both want the job. And then beyond this group, you've got Tyke Hayes, who's been on campus since the winter, Jabri Coleman, who got to town in the summer as a freshman. So an ongoing position competition. 3 guys seem to be at the forefront of it. We'll see if we can get a little bit more of kind of track record from all of them or a few of them this Saturday. Daniel, over at linebacker, this is another area where we'd like to learn more beyond the obvious top of the depth chart. We know Amari Campbell, Tony Rojas, and Dom DeLuca are going to play a bunch of football and defense this year. They've played a bunch of football through 2 matchups. Keon Wiley has been the next most involved, right around 30 or so snaps through the first couple of games. And then Anthony Specco is around 10 snaps in each of the first couple of games. Alex Tash, the freshman, seems to be maybe the other linebacker that we're keeping an eye on here, along with Dakari Nelson, as we got to look at some defensive work. You were over on that side of the field yesterday. You had our notebook. What do you make of the linebacker situation, and how much of an emphasis do you think Dan Connor, Jim Knowles, and the defensive staff, if they have the opportunity, got to place on getting some game evaluation of this group before they have to tread into, Big Ten play and much bigger challenges?
Definitely. On our Zoom with Dan Connor earlier Thursday, he said that all those practice reps are really nice and they put them in all the different situations, but there's no substitute for getting game reps out there. And he echoed what we talked about a little bit, where it's pretty clear that there's that top 3. Then you've got a second group behind them with, the playing time, I think, shows that Keon Wiley is top there. But Alex Tash is pretty interesting. That name came up multiple times from Dan Connor, unprompted. I think it was in response to your question, Tyler, when you asked specifically about Wiley and Specca, and he starts talking about other depth pieces. Tash was still in his scout team jersey on Wednesday evening. But as we've seen at certain positions, you can still do that and have a role on Saturdays. So that'll be something to watch there. I mean, Tash is pretty noticeable physically out there on the field. I think I've been mentioning him since the spring in terms of someone who just looks like he belongs out there, looks like he's moving well. We haven't seen it in games yet or for an extended period, but I think that's a name to watch as sort of what James Franklin talks about, where, all right, these guys might not be able to help you against Oregon in week 4, but by the time you get to, Indiana in November, maybe even Ohio State in November, maybe other guys can step up to help you there. And I think I would put him in that category just because he's a true freshman, even though he enrolled early. So we'll see as this goes along. You would like to see more depth there, but it's kind of similar to the RB3 thing where, we talk a lot about the depth and needing to generate it. And we've been talking about it the past 2 years, and it hasn't really become a dire need at any point. We know that can change in an instant, but I do wonder some of the stuff, like it's going to be the end of November and we're going to be like, oh, they only played 3 linebackers again. They only played 2 running backs again, and they're achieved their goals, something like that. But we'll see. I mean, but something to watch against Villanova, a game where theoretically you should be able to see lots of guys like Tash.
Yeah, with the sport like football, it's hard to be able to know that you'll have those 2 same running backs in late November where you need them to be health wise. Same deal for those top 3 running backs with the pounding that these positions take. But last year they avoided that kind of issue, having to go down the deeper into the well for their depth. But I don't think you can just count on that. And so we'll see if they can start to discover a little bit more this Saturday from that group. If Tash gets involved, it would be his first game action as a college player. We only saw 3 freshmen get involved last Saturday: Yvonne Kamaju and Chaz Coleman at defensive end, and then Darius Dixon at cornerback. And we saw 8 freshmen involved a week earlier in the season opener. Penn State would certainly like this one to play out more like that. Mark, when we look at the offensive line, depth has been a big topic of conversation, but when things were tighter last week, we certainly saw maybe where Phil Troutwine's head is at regarding the top 5. Those starting 5 that Drew Shelton, Venga Ioane, Nick Dawkins, Anthony Donko, and also Nolan Rucci, they were all over, I think, 45, 50 snaps last week. No one else was at 20 snaps. TJ Shanahan was the next one involved. We saw Cooper Cousins involved, limited to less than 10 snaps total. And that was really about it until the very end of this thing when they can empty the sideline just a little. But, Mark, when you look at this game, we saw 11 players with the varsity group during our look at Wednesday's practice. Owen Alicine and Egan Boyer were both working behind Drew Shelton at left tackle, Dominic Rulli behind Nick Dawkins at center, Cooper Cousins at left guard. We also saw TJ Shanahan at right guard, and then Garrett Sexton at right tackle. I'm glad I was able to reel off 11 in front of you. Once I started, I couldn't stop. So, Mark, there's 11 dudes there. I think this, again, projects as an opportunity to showcase that depth a little bit more. But in your opinion, how do you marry trying to make sure you've got a cohesive offensive line group that is firing on better cylinders going into the bye week with also trying to get a lot of guys involved over the course of this Saturday?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was getting at before a little bit in terms of explosive plays early, getting things rolling early. So later in the game, you're able to get those guys out there. That had to be a disappointment for the coaching staff, that a lot of those guys, the way that game played out, they really didn't get those late offensive drives. You had Katron break the long run, and then basically you have a near scoop and score down to the 5, was it, by Coleman, and then I think Singleton took it in on the next play. And I think part of that was realizing that Singleton wasn't playing with the confidence that maybe that they wanted, the decisiveness, however you want to say it. So that had to be a disappointment coming out of that FIU game. My words, I don't know. I would imagine it is to them. I don't want to put words in their mouth. But, yeah, so this game, I think it's absolutely imperative because right now you're in a position where, I wonder if Cooper Cousins was a little banged up. Remember, we didn't see him at practice last week on Wednesday. Maybe they were taking it easy with him. But I think at this point we know that they're comfortable with Shanahan or Cooper Cousins in there. But we've seen it with the offensive line. I always say, knock on wood, I hope nobody gets hurt. But it's going to be important to get reps for some of the other 4 linemen that you mentioned, Tyler, to see who's maybe ready to step in later in the season or midway through the season if something goes a little haywire. So, yeah, I think it's absolutely imperative for them to get some more distance early in the second half so they're able to get a longer look. That was, I was down there on the field toward the end of the game, so it's hard to judge who's getting how many snaps. And you put together the snap counts, and I go and look at that, and I was kind of stunned that, like, more of the backups didn't get snaps. But then I thought, well, given how this game played out, especially on offense, it kind of made sense.
Yeah, feels like you kind of missed on what we thought maybe be a quarter of work for a lot of guys who aren't going to get a lot of game work this season.
Running backs. I mean, I looked at that, and I was like I'm down there, and you're not looking at individual personnel down there. You're kind of seeing how the game's going. By that point, I'm watching Franklin's reaction. I'm listening to Dan Connor talk to, making sure that the right person has the green dot on. So I'm looking at different stuff because I know you guys have everything else covered. But then you look at the snaps, and it's like, wow, the backup running backs didn't play a single snap in that game.
Yeah, byproduct of scoring only 10 points on 6 first-half possessions that got into enemy territory. You had a chance to pile up some points, maybe put yourself in a spot to empty the sideline a bit toward the end. Did not happen. We'll see if it happens this time around. And, Daniel, the key to that will be avoiding what James Franklin referred to last week as a sluggish start for his squad. I think it was probably a sluggish environment in Happy Valley last Saturday as well, in part because of the team's slow start. I don't think the crowd really got going over the course of the game. And so you're looking for more of a complete atmosphere, complete performance on the field against Villanova. And to me, that conversation is going to start with this offense and what we see from quarterback Drew Aller, running back Nick Singleton, guys who are seniors, guys who are very much in a lot of people's minds kind of set it and forget it coming into the season. And that wasn't really the case last Saturday. And so to me, I kind of attach that avoiding the sluggish start to, is this going to be a get right game and a get right first quarter for the quarterback and the star running back?
I think that you want to see the offense come out and make the easy ones. It's that cliche with basketball players where it's like you see one go through the net and then suddenly you feel a lot better about yourself and you can go from there. I think that that's what you're going to want to see from Drew Aller, from Nick Singleton. Make a couple plays. Doesn't have to be an 80-yard bomb, doesn't have to be a 65-yard touchdown run, but just you're making those easy plays, kind of like what Drew Aller said, make the easy throws easy. And then you can build that rhythm, go from there. I do think you make a good point about the crowd falling out of it, Tyler. I mean, you go back and you watch that game, FIU has a delay a game on the very first play. But then everyone starts to get a little bit restless when the offense can't get moving. You see the mistakes, and it just makes for I think more tense atmosphere than maybe you were expecting for that sort of game.
Daniel, it probably took until that 42-yard touchdown catch for Devontae Ross with like 5 minutes to go in the third quarter until you felt like the crowd loosened up a little bit and got to enjoy themselves again.
Definitely, everyone unclenched a little bit. So I just think that you need to see some rhythm early. You need to move the ball early. I think it's easy to say, like we've done the past 2 weeks, like get up 42-zip at halftime and play the backups the whole second half. I think the overall Penn State experience the past couple of years has shown us that is often not the case, or it's easier said than done, especially when they have certain things that they want to work on in a certain way they want to go about things. But I think where you are right now, like you want to see Aller and Singleton come out, have a rhythm, that whole offense move the ball a little bit. Maybe you do go up 14-0 in the first quarter and everyone can relax. The defense can let loose, the fan base can let loose. Then maybe you're on the right path. But I think it all starts pretty early on for Penn State.
Mark, let's keep it on the offense. Villanova's defense, they want to create chaos, in the words of James Franklin. They run that 3-3 stack with a 3-man front, 3 linebackers where you've got twists and stunts, and they try to make things unpredictable. They held Penn State in check really well a few years ago on the ground, under 3 yards per carry. Of course, that proved to be one of the worst rushing attacks in the power conferences, that 2021 Penn State team. So this time around, what are you looking for from Penn State's offense? Trying to deal with some of the more exotic stuff, maybe schematically Villanova is going to send your way with inferior athletes compared to what Penn State is putting on the field. But the explosive plays are in the spotlight. Struggles on third down last week are in the spotlight. So where is your focus land on offense going into this matchup, Mark?
Yeah, I'll be like Daniel using a basketball analogy. John Wooden used to say, you don't worry about preparing for the other team. You prepare as well as you can prepare, and you should be good. That's the case against this team. I'm going to be looking straight at that offensive line. Obviously, you want to see, as I mentioned earlier, you want to see Aller and Singleton smooth things out a little bit. But to me, this offensive line needs to step up and do what it does. I don't care, stack, whatever, odd man front coming at you at crazy angles. I keep going back to that 94-0 line. They didn't care what they faced. They ran into some trouble out at Illinois, but ultimately when that game was on the line, they marched right down the field and were able to score on a fullback dive. So I think the offensive line really has to establish itself no matter what it faces, do what it needs to do. So other people are going to have to adjust to what you're doing. You're at the point now against this level of competition. Oregon's going to be a different story. Yeah, you have to game plan specifically. And there will be things that they have to game plan specifically for Villanova. You have to respect Villanova. I agree with James Franklin. But I want to see this offensive line impose its will on somebody and start to become that unit that a lot of us thought it was going to be.
From the offensive line to the defensive line, Daniel, it feels like this D-line is really rounding into form, maybe ahead of where we anticipated. Part of that is Chaz Coleman has been this freshman sensation. We're all curious where it goes next with him. Could he be a freshman All-American type? And what does that mean? Because we didn't think this Penn State defense had a freshman All-American as part of the plan this year going into August, and all of a sudden they might. But you throw in what we've seen from Nittany White in some brief glimpses and some of the feedback on his transition from defensive end to defensive tackle. What we have seen from Zariah Fisher briefly in one game back, 7 total pressures, kind of checked off a lot of things you wanted to see in his first game since 2023. Xavier Gilliam has looked the part of a riser, a guy who's starting worthy, but Alonzo Ford has also looked like he belongs in the starting lineup at defensive tackle. So when we get through non-conference play here, Daniel, another day of strong work for the defensive line, and we'll see if they can produce it. But I'm of the mind that this is a unit, to credit Deion Barnes, that is in a better spot going into Big Ten play than perhaps we would have projected in late July.
The sample size for this group was just so small entering the season, when it was basically Denai Dennis Sutton, Zane Durant, and you had like 11 games of Alonzo Ford last year. That was pretty much all you were bringing back from last year in terms of significant contributions. And so I think these first 2 games, you really wanted to see what you had from all perspectives. I think seeing what Zariah Fisher did against FIU, that makes you feel a whole lot better. Seeing Chaz Coleman turn some of those almost into actual plays, I think that's really significant. And it seems like the growth curve for him is just pointed straight up. It's the hockey stick right now in terms of where he's headed. And then on the interior, like we've heard all these good things about Xavier Gilliam throughout last year and this offseason, but we hadn't seen it. He's been pretty disruptive in there. And it really does seem like he's pushing Alonzo forward for some of that playing time next to Durant. Then you go just further down the list, like Owen Wafel and I White. They weren't here last year, and I White wasn't even a defensive tackle. It's just been an opportunity to learn so much more about this group. I don't think we necessarily doubted that they would be talented or productive or have the ability to do what they've done. It was just a question that we'd never seen it. And some of these guys, like we'd never seen them, period. So I think having this sample size now, I think you feel better about where they are. And then I think that another strong performance, you look at that Oregon game a little bit differently in terms of what that battle is going to look like up front.
Yeah, and not to mention Jalen Harvey, who started game 1, got a lot of work in game 2. He's feeling more comfortable. I think he's flashed a bit. And then you go down that list, and a guy like Malachi Williams, Ivan Kamaju, they're not at the top of the depth chart, but all of a sudden you feel pretty good about your third string at defensive end because you've gotten some look at them. And this will be another key week for some of those young players to get a lot of involvement, because really beyond that, I think Chaz Coleman and Xavier Gilliam, we expect to see a lot of them Big Ten play. Nothing really promised for some of these other players. Mark, Daniel, it's time. Let's get to our players to watch, followed by predictions. And in terms of players to watch, we're starting with you, Mr. Gallen.
I'm going to go with Nittany White. I think that we saw that little flash there at the end where he got the sack against FIU. If the game goes the way that we think it should be going, he could see a lot of playing time. He's also, I think, maybe even more so than some of these other younger players, he needs this run because it's a new position for him. He hasn't played a lot of football in a long time. You need to see what he can do. I just think that the feedback that we've gotten on him has been really interesting in terms of how he's really taken to that position. I talked to TJ Shanahan on Wednesday night. He was with White over at Texas A&M, and he described all the difficulties that someone with White's build and physique can really do or can really cause for an interior offensive lineman. And I think when FCS team, it's not exactly the biggest maulers down there on the interior. So I think that maybe this we can see Nittany White, hit some of those 3-pointers, see the ball go through the net. You know what you have with him a little bit more as we move forward, because this is even though he's a redshirt junior, he's a developmental guy for them right now. And it's about this year, and it's also about next year. But you want him to be in a position where down the stretch he can really help you.
Picked up a sack last Saturday. He only had 2 of those in his career with Texas A&M through 3 seasons down in College Station. A guy that we've heard just simply looks faster, looks more athletic now that he's inside versus outside. It may have taken a little bit of pitching the idea to him in August to make sure he was fully on board with wrapping his head around becoming a defensive tackle. But the staff thinks, and I think Nittany White is beginning to believe, that this is the best path forward for him to finish his college career and potentially to break through onto an NFL roster down the road. Mark, who is your player to watch?
I'm going with a position, if I can do that. Punt returner. And bear with me here. I think there are going to be a lot of punts in this game by Villanova. And, whether it's Ross, whether it's Pena, does Tyser Denmark get back there? I'm sure I'm missing somebody. But we saw Pena in the first game, I thought was fearless back there. Ross is obviously super quick. I think you're going to see something fun happen out of that. That's not going to be my bold prediction, but I'm anxious to see if they were just testing out different guys, or if because they were a little bit worried about Ross, that's why he wasn't going in the first game. But I think they have some really good options back there, and I'm anxious to see how they continue along and if they start to narrow it down in this last non-conference game heading into the bye week and then the Big Ten opener.
opposite of narrowing it down, does Zion Tracy, reintroduce himself to the punt return?
We haven't seen him there yet. So
exactly. Yeah. Back one game, strictly was playing defense. We'll see if he pops up back deep. I think you're right, Mark. There's going to be a high number of punts coming from 33-year-old punter Luke Larson. God bless college football. God bless these Australian punters. Some of the best stories we encounter on an annual basis. I'm going to go with one of the guys you just mentioned. I'm going to say Devontae Ross. And this is kind of me focusing on two players because James Franklin told us pretty solidly going into the season that it's going to be Trevor Pena's job. It's going to be Kyron Hudson's job. When they want to come off the field, they can tap on their helmet. But he made it very clear Devontae Ross and Liam Clifford were in a shared workload. When week one, we saw Clifford handle the vast majority of those reps. We have since learned that Devontae Ross was in a really tough spot, probably tougher than we realized this summer. They didn't think he'd be available until game 4, and yet he's on the field game 1. He played about 13 or so snaps on offense. Another week of recovery later, another week of practice later, those roles were essentially flipped. Devontae Ross was on the field for a bunch of action. Liam Clifford, I should say, was barely on the field on offense. I think he played about a dozen snaps this time around. It was his first time under 20 snaps. You have to go back a couple seasons. So I'm curious if Devontae Ross takes even more of this job. It's probably going to be hard to tell if this one, if the game flow dictates it's a blowout. But is Devontae Ross going to go into the Oregon game more in command of this job than sharing it with Liam Clifford? And I went back and I gathered some stats based on snap counts and some production from recent years and more recently this season. And just comparing the two, Liam Clifford, you go back to last November, since the start of last November, 4 total catches, 40 receiving yards. That's about 350 total receiver snaps across 11 games. I know he gets lauded for his blocking, for his role as a culture guy. But just talking about pass game production, 4 catches for 40 yards on 350 snaps is a tough one to take for your offense. And Devontae Ross, 2 games into his Penn State career, 52 total snaps. He has 4 catches. He has 65 yards, and he has a 42-yard touchdown as part of that resume as well. So focusing on Devontae Ross, but it's kind of a two-man story because I think there's a chance that we could see those 3 transfer receivers reach Big Ten play firmly in control of their respective positions. And that would say a lot about what Penn State was able to go out and grab, and perhaps a little bit about what was in this position room before they brought in the transfer players as well. It's time for predictions, and we're going to give you not just our score predictions, but by now you know to expect some bold predictions from us as well. Mark, get us going.
I think if Penn State had played more smoothly on offense last week, my 51-6 pick would have been spot on. I do think you're going to see them smooth things out for a couple of reasons. Number one, as I said, to me, Aller and Singleton have earned the benefit of the doubt. I think they're going to get back into form against this level of opponent. And number two, the coaching staff, we don't know exactly what was in their head those first 2 games. How much did we see? Were they holding things back? We know that they were playing a lot of different players. I think in this game, it's important to set a tone going into that bye week, a positive tone. So I'm not saying they're going to open things up and be crazy, but I think they're going to treat this more like, must-win situation very early in the game where they can establish that tone. So I'm going with 51-6 again and hoping it's right. This time, my bold prediction almost got a defensive score last week from Chaz Coleman. I think it happens this week, but not from Chaz. I think the takeaway king, Zakee Wheatley, has a pick 6. This is a team that's going to have to throw the ball a ton. If you take out the quarterback's rushing yards against Colgate, they average, I think, 2.4 yards per carry. That's against Colgate. What do you think is going to happen against this Penn State defense? So they're going to have to throw the ball a lot, and I think that's going to put some opportunities up there. Takeaway king as good as anybody to take advantage of that.
Full disclosure, we all made our predictions before a betting line was available. When it's an FCS, FBS matchup, tends to pop up later in the week. Usually it's available like Sunday afternoon. We had to wait until Wednesday night, and it was 48 points, but these picks aren't based on that. Daniel, what do you got for us?
Well, we've got Mark besmirching the Colgate Raiders before I go to a Colgate wedding this weekend. That's some synergy. But no, I mean, I agree with Mark in terms of what you can see from the approach on things from Penn State. I do think that Villanova, this is a very well-coached program. We know what they did 4 years ago. We know that they're going to be prepared even if there's going to be a ginormous talent gap in there. I think Penn State's going to take advantage, but I do think they'll get up early. And I think that we'll see these line changes come in. I think that they really realize how important it is to get these reps in. And I think that'll ultimately keep this game maybe a little bit closer than some of the predictions. I have Penn State 48, Villanova 13. I could see this being 28 zip at halftime, 35-3 early in the third. And then you see all those young guys in and they get those full reps. Big reason for Penn State jumping out to that lead is my bold prediction. We're going to see Nick Singleton letting it rip. I've got him 65-plus yard touchdown run and goes over 100 yards for only his second 100-yard game in the past calendar year. Franklin said that he talked to Singleton on Sunday. He talked to Stan Drayton and Charles Walker, the assistant running backs coach. And it seems like they feel like, they got whatever was going on last week. They have it sorted out. And I think we'll see Singleton really respond to that coaching in a big way.
Yeah, I'm leaning toward this being more of a get-right game, a phrase I mentioned earlier, than kind of concerns lingering into the bye week game. It won't be perfect. A few games are, but I think with the amount of players they'll get involved, I think with the kind of polish that they'll display a little bit more on offense early in this game, it'll be one that makes internally and externally people feel better about these Nittany Lions. And I know there's maybe a sentiment that the players don't care. They're focused on a 34-0 win. They want to look better too. They want to feel more confident in their ability to execute. They want to create explosive plays so they remember what that feels like and how you create them before having to generate them for the first time all season in the bright lights of a whiteout. So I think they genuinely do care, not just about the final score of this game, but how they look reaching the finish line of this matchup. And I'm not saying Drew Aller is going to throw for 400 yards like we saw Sean Clifford do a few years ago against Villanova, but I think he'll look back on track. And I think part of the reason he won't need to throw for that much is we'll see a running game that goes for 240 plus rushing yards. That's my bold prediction. 4 years ago, they managed only 80 rushing yards, less than 3 per carry. It was a huge red flag. We all realized the ground game was in trouble. I think we get to kind of shake that off in a significant way. 240 plus rushing yards for Penn State in a 48-3 victory over Villanova. That's my forecast. Daniel, before we say goodbye, you are stepping away for a wedding, as you mentioned. We hope you have a blast. We hope you spend a bunch of time on the dance floor and come back.
Let it rip up there, Daniel.
Let it rip on that dance floor. But any advice for young Tyler Calvaruso, who is making his Beaver Stadium debut in the press box alongside us?
Yeah, I would just say, well, first of all, I'm not scared of a fall wedding, so we can put that discourse away. But no, I'm excited for Tyler to get the chance. I mean, I remember my first time covering a game in Beaver Stadium. I think it was Ball State 2021, and it was just something very cool. So he's got to remember, bring his binoculars, bring some sunscreen in our new digs, and know where you're going and get that pregame scouting report down so you don't get lost.
Yeah, I remember my first game in 1961. Rip Angle had a hell of a team that year.
Well, we'll have some fun. We'll miss you, Daniel, but we hope you have a great weekend. We'll get you back on board on the podcast next week for some fresh perspective on whatever went down in Game 3. But Tyler Calvaruso, Mark Brennan, and myself, along with our photographer, Grace Brennan, back in Beaver Stadium. We'll be there early ahead of a 3:30 kickoff. Follow our pregame, in-game, and post-game coverage, including a post-game podcast debut from TC over at Lions247.com and right here on Lions247 Podcast. For these guys, I'm Tyler Donahue. This is always for following our coverage at Lions247. This has been the Lions247 Podcast.